There is a country where an animal known only from fossils was found alive and grazing in the dust 50 years after science declared it extinct. There is a place where two languages are spoken so completely together that most sentences belong to neither one alone. Somewhere in this country, a waterfall with a flow roughly twice that of Niagara's was swallowed whole by a single dam, and the world barely noticed. There is a forest where families still choose, deliberately, to have never met an outsider. There is a town of brick houses and Mennonite church bells sitting in the middle of a thornbush desert, built by refugees who arrived by ox cart. And there is a drink, made from a plant leaf and cold water, that is shared from a single cup passed hand to hand among strangers as a kind of social contract older than the state itself. This is Paraguay, a landlocked nation wedged between Argentina, Brazil, and Bolivia in the heart of South America, with no coastline and, for much of its history, no attention from the outside world. It does not have the glaciers of Patagonia or the beaches of Rio. It has something quieter, one of the only places on the continent where an indigenous language is spoken by the majority of the population, mixed daily into the language of its former colonizers, spoken in parliament, in pop songs, in grocery stores. Why did Guaraní survive here when so many indigenous languages elsewhere were erased? How did a group of pacifist farmers from Russia and Canada end up building a fully functioning German-speaking city in one of the harshest deserts on Earth? What did this country have to give up, and who had to be moved so that its neighbors could keep their lights on? And how does a nation that fought the deadliest war in Latin American history, then lived through one of its longest dictatorships, still manage to describe itself, unironically, as simple? The answer doesn't begin in a textbook. It begins on an ordinary morning in Asunción, as the fog lifts off the Paraguay River and vendors wheel handcarts of chipa past office workers already sipping something warm from a leather-wrapped gourd. Asunción sits on the eastern bank of the Paraguay River, founded on August 15, 1537, by the Spanish conquistador Juan de Salazar y Espinosa, who named it Nuestra Señora Santa María de la Asunción after the feast day on which his expedition landed. It is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in South America, old enough that when Buenos Aires was burned and abandoned by its own colonists in 1541 after an uprising, the survivors fled upriver to Asunción for shelter. That single fact earned the city its enduring nickname, the Mother of Cities, the base from which expeditions later departed to found Santa Fe, Corrientes, and the second permanent Buenos Aires. Asunción became Paraguay's capital in earnest after independence was declared on the night of the 14th to the 15th of May 1811, when a group of local officers led by Pedro Juan Caballero forced the Spanish governor to resign without firing a shot, one of the quietest independence movements in the Americas. Walk through the old center today and the layering is immediate. The pink and white Palacio de los López, a 19th century presidential palace built in a French Second Empire style, stands a few blocks from glass-fronted towers financed by Brazilian and Chinese capital, while behind both, along the riverbank, sits Chacarita, an informal settlement of stilted wooden homes that floods almost every year when the Paraguay River rises. It is a 5-minute walk from a 5-star hotel to a neighborhood without reliable plumbing, and that contrast is not incidental to the city. It is close to the city's defining feature. Long before any of that, though, there is a ritual that structures the day for millions of Paraguayans, one that has nothing to do with the capital's skyline. It is called tereré, and it begins with yerba mate, the dried, ground leaf of Ilex paraguariensis, a holly relative native to the region. Unlike its hot cousin mate, Sipped in Argentina and southern Brazil, tereré is drunk cold. A hollowed gourd, called a guampa, is packed nearly full with yerba, then filled with icy water, often infused with mint, lemongrass, or medicinal herbs bought fresh at street corner herb stalls known as puestos de yuyos. The drinker sips through a metal straw with a filtered tip called a bombilla. Traditionally, one person drinks the serving and passes the vessel back to be refilled, although practices vary between groups and settings. Nobody drinks from their own cup while excluding others. The guampa moves in rotation, and refusing a turn without explanation is considered mildly rude. Office workers carry thermoses of ice water under one arm through the heat of the afternoon, specifically to keep the ritual going at their desks. It is not simply hydration, it is a social architecture, a reason for people to sit together and do nothing productive for 20 minutes several times a day, and it is taken seriously enough that UNESCO inscribed the tradition in 2020 on its representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity, framing it as a marker of communal identity as much as any monument. Not every custom here carries that same gravity. On 23 and 24 June, the San Juan festivities, honoring the feast of St. John the Baptist, bring fire walking over hot coals, called Tata Ari Jahasa, and a spinning game called the Pelota Tata, a ball of rags soaked in kerosene, and set alight, swung on a rope for young men to dodge, while a costumed figure called Toro Candil, wearing a torch-studded wooden bull's head frame, charges through crowds of laughing onlookers who scatter and regroup, daring each other to get close. It is treated less as solemn religious observance than as communal thrill-seeking, an accepted, supervised brush with danger that closes out the mid-year cold snap. Move from ritual to speech, and the country's defining contradiction sharpens further. Paraguay has two official languages, Spanish and Guaraní. A status Guaraní has held constitutionally since 1992. Surveys differ on the precise breakdown, but they converge on a broad pattern. Something close to half the population speaks both fluently, roughly a third speaks primarily or only Guaraní, and a minority concentrated in Asunción itself speaks mostly Spanish. In daily conversation, the two rarely stay separated. The blend is called jopara, a Guaraní word that literally means mixture, in which Spanish vocabulary sits inside Guaraní grammar, or the reverse, switching mid-sentence without anyone noticing they've done it. Guaraní tends to dominate at home, on the farm, in jokes and affection and scolding. Spanish dominates in courtrooms, universities, and formal writing. The language's documented history stretches back to the earliest years of the colony. The Franciscan friar Luis de Bolaños translated the Catechism into Guaraní in the late 16th century, one of the first systematic efforts anywhere in the Americas to write an indigenous language using Latin script, laying groundwork that Jesuit missionaries would later expand into full grammars and dictionaries. Paraguay is the only country in the Americas where a language of indigenous origin is spoken as a first or fluent language by a majority of a non-indigenous population, an inversion of nearly every other colonial linguistic story on the continent. Housing across the country reflects a similar split between tradition and hard necessity. In rural areas, especially the humid east, traditional homes are still built with adobe or wattle and daub walls called estantio, framed by hardwood posts and roofed with ceramic tile or dried palm thatch called caranday, both chosen because they shed tropical rains and stay cool under a sun that regularly tops 38 degrees Celsius in summer. Verandas, or corridors, wrap around these homes to create shaded outdoor living space, since much of daily life happens outside rather than in. It is a smart, climate-adapted design, and it coexists with real hardship. Paraguay remains one of the most unequal countries in Latin America in terms of land distribution, and a significant share of the rural population still lacks piped water or a formal electrical connection, drawing instead from wells or shared community taps. Food organizes the day here almost as firmly as tereré does. Breakfast, desayuno, is light. Cocido, a toasted caramelized yerba mate infusion, sometimes mixed with milk, alongside chipa, a cheese bread made from cassava starch or mandioca flour, eggs, and Paraguayan cheese, formed into rings or knots, and traditionally baked in a clay oven called a tatacua. Mid-morning brings tereré again, often with a snack like mbeju, a flat, crisp cassava and cheese griddle cake folded like an omelette. Lunch, the day's largest meal, centers on sopa paraguaya, which despite its name is not a soup at all, but a dense, savory cornbread made with cornmeal, cheese, onion, and milk. A batter too thick to stay liquid when it bakes, according to local legend, after a cook's mistake became a national dish. It is served alongside asado, grilled beef, and often chipa guasu, a softer corn and cheese casserole similar to a spoon bread. Afternoon brings tereré a third time, joined by kiveve, a sweet savory puree of squash cooked down with milk, sugar, and cornmeal until thick. Dinner tends to be lighter. Vori vori, also called bori bori, a chicken soup studded with small cornmeal and cheese dumplings. On special occasions, families prepare mbe pisou, a warm cornmeal porridge cooked with shredded beef, or payagua mascada, fried spiced ground beef mixed with cassava starch, whose name translates roughly to chewed by the payagua, referencing an indigenous group from the Paraguay River Basin. Dessert, when there is one, is often dulce de guayaba, a thick guava paste, or dulce de mamon, candied green papaya, both eaten in small sweet spoonfuls, usually alongside a final round of cocido. The calendar carries its own, quieter beliefs, ones nobody claims are scientific, but that shape behavior anyway. On the eve of San Juan, families place a basin of water outside overnight. The shape's egg whites form when dropped into the water at dawn, are read half-jokingly as omens for the coming year, a practice called clara de huevo. Around the same date, some households still avoid lending money or salt, a superstition rooted in older Guaraní beliefs about the spirit Pombero, a small, hairy forest guardian said to punish disrespect toward nature and hospitality with mischief, ranging from hidden tools to unsettling noises at night. Paraguayans will tell you plainly that they don't believe it, and then quietly leave a bit of tobacco or honey out as an offering anyway, just in case. A habit that speaks less to superstition than to a culture that has learned to hold two truths, the rational and the inherited, without needing to resolve the tension between them. Geographically, the Paraguay River splits the country almost exactly in two, physically and culturally. To the east lies the fertile, hilly region where most Paraguayans live, historically part of the Atlantic forest ecoregion, now heavily cleared for soy and cattle. To the west spreads the Gran Chaco, a vast, sparsely populated lowland of dry thorn scrub and seasonal wetland stretching into Bolivia and Argentina, covering roughly 87 million hectares across all three countries, an area close to twice the size of California. It is one of the fastest disappearing forests on the planet. Studies estimate the Paraguayan Chaco lost around a fifth of its forest cover between 2000 and 2019, driven mostly by cattle ranching. The Pilcomayo River, forming part of the border with Argentina, and the Paraná, forming the southeastern border with Argentina and Brazil, bracket the country along with the Paraguay River itself, giving this landlocked nation an outsized dependence on water transport for trade it cannot access by sea. That same Chaco forest holds one of Paraguay's strangest wildlife stories. The Chacoan peccary, known locally as the jaguar, was known to science for decades only through fossilized bone fragments described in 1930 and assumed to have died out, along with the Ice Age megafauna it lived alongside. In 1975, the zoologist Ralph Wetzel confirmed what some local Chaco communities already knew. The animal was alive, roaming the dry thorn forest in small herds, indistinguishable in behavior from a species everyone assumed had vanished 10,000 years earlier. It remains one of only a handful of mammals in modern history to be rediscovered this way, and it remains endangered, with wild populations across Paraguay, Bolivia, and Argentina now estimated in the low thousands. Further east, the Mbaracayú Forest Nature Reserve protects 64,405 hectares of the last significant stretch of interior Atlantic forest left in the country, home to roughly 90 species of mammals and more than 400 species of birds, including the white-winged nightjar, a bird so rare that only a handful of confirmed sites for it exist anywhere on Earth, several of them here. Paraguay generates far more electricity than it uses, and that surplus comes from Itaipu, the hydroelectric dam it shares equally with Brazil on the Paraná River, built under a binational treaty signed in 1973, began generating electricity in 1984 and reached its full 20-unit capacity in 2007. Itaipu's 20 turbines, each rated at 700 megawatts, give it an installed capacity of 14,000 megawatts, and it supplies close to 90% of all the electricity Paraguay consumes, exporting most of its remaining share to Brazil, since Paraguay's own domestic demand is a fraction of what the dam produces. But that surplus power had a cost, measured in something that no longer exists. The Guaira Falls, once a series of cataracts on the Paraná with a flow roughly twice that of Niagara's, considered by some geographers the most voluminous waterfall system on the planet, was completely and permanently submerged beneath Itaipu's reservoir when it filled in 1982. A landmark that had drawn awe for centuries disappeared in a matter of weeks, traded for a power grid. It is one of the country's quieter, starker contradictions, a nation that lights much of southern Brazil, while, according to its own national statistics, a meaningful share of its rural households still go without a formal water connection. Southeast of Asunción, in the department of Itapúa, the ruins of two Jesuit mission towns, La Santísima Trinidad del Paraná and Jesús de Tavarangue, were inscribed together as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1993, Paraguay's only listing on that roster. Jesuit missionaries arrived in the region in the late 16th century, and by the following century had organized roughly 30 settlements across what is now Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil, known as reducciones, planned communities where Guaraní families lived, farmed, and worshipped under Jesuit administration, protected, at least nominally, from the forced labor encomienda system devastating indigenous populations elsewhere in the Spanish Empire. Trinidad, the best preserved of the group, still shows its central plaza, cloisters, and a carved stone pulpit and bell tower standing over red sandstone ruins. Jesús de Tavarangue, 12 kilometers away, was left permanently unfinished when Spain expelled the Jesuits from its American territories in 1767, its half-built arches still open to the sky, frozen mid-construction for 2.5 centuries. Not every community in this landscape wanted contact with any of it, colonial or modern. In the deep Chaco, the Ayoreo Totobiegasode remain one of the very few indigenous peoples in South America outside the Amazon believed to include groups still living in voluntary isolation, having deliberately avoided sustained contact with the outside world altogether. Contacted branches of the same people have spent close to 3 decades pursuing legal recognition of their ancestral territory, land that once covered well over 1 million hectares and has shrunk drastically under pressure from cattle ranching and logging. Some of that same land now overlaps with Mennonite-owned ranches and Brazilian and Argentine agribusiness concessions. Forced encounters in past decades, when isolated family groups were pushed out of the forest by bulldozers clearing land for pasture, have led to documented outbreaks of respiratory illness among people with no prior immunity. A pattern rights groups have repeatedly flagged as a life-or-death argument for leaving uncontacted communities alone and their forest intact. The Ayoreo's neighbors in the Chaco, ironically, are themselves the descendants of another displaced community. Beginning in 1927, groups of Mennonites, pacifist Anabaptist Christians of German and Russian heritage, fleeing religious persecution and forced military conscription, first in Canada, then in Stalin's Soviet Union, negotiated land grants from the Paraguayan government to settle the empty Chaco. Menno Colony was founded first, in 1926 and 1927, by families arriving from Canada. Fernheim Colony followed in 1930, built by refugees who had escaped the Soviet Union only months earlier. Newland Colony came after the Second World War in 1947, founded by displaced Mennonites too old, too poor, or too war-worn to be accepted by countries like Canada that wanted younger settlers. Today, the town of Philadelphia, administrative heart of Fernheim Colony, functions almost like a transplanted piece of Germany. Red brick buildings, cooperative dairies, Plautjetsch spoken on the street, all sitting inside a semi-arid thornbush landscape locals once nicknamed the Green Hell. The Mennonites transformed that land into some of the country's most productive dairy and cattle operations, and their arrival was at the time actively encouraged by a Paraguayan government eager to establish a permanent population in the Chaco ahead of a looming border dispute with Bolivia. That same land, however, had belonged to Ayoreo, Nivaclé, and Enelhet communities first, and the overlapping claims between Mennonite ranches and indigenous territorial rights remain a live source of tension in the region today. Music carries its own version of that Guaraní and European blending. The Guarania, a slow, melancholic genre generally written in 6/8 with rhythms related to the Paraguayan polka, was created in 1925 by composer José Asunción Flores, who lived from 1904 to 1972 and deliberately slowed traditional Paraguayan rhythms to give the music a more reflective character, distinct from the faster polka paraguaya that dominated before it. The polka itself evolved into something rhythmically distinct from its Central European namesake, often performed on the Paraguayan harp, an instrument with roughly 36 to 40 strings that became a national symbol over the 20th century, alongside guitar virtuoso Agustín Barrios Mangoré, who lived from 1885 to 1944 and remains one of classical guitar's most recorded composers worldwide. The signature dance tied to this music is the Danza de la Botella, in which a woman balances a stack of glass bottles, sometimes lit candles, on her head, while performing intricate zapateado footwork, a feat requiring a stillness of the upper body that borders on theatrical illusion. Religion runs through the calendar as firmly as folklore does. The overwhelming majority of Paraguayans identify as Roman Catholic, and the country's most significant pilgrimage centers on the Basílica de Nuestra Señora de Caacupé, roughly 50 kilometers from Asunción, where hundreds of thousands of pilgrims travel, some walking for days, to arrive by December 8th, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, honoring the Virgen de los Milagros de Cacupé. In the town of San Ignacio de Yatitay, and especially Tañarandi near San Ignacio, Holy Week draws crowds for a candlelit procession held on Holy Saturday, when thousands of hand-poured candles line dirt roads and courtyards through the night, illuminating tableaux built from natural materials, an event that has grown from a local devotional practice into one of the most visually striking religious gatherings in the country. Craft traditions here are, in a real sense, endangered in their own right. Nyandati lace, whose name in Guaraní means spiderweb, is produced almost entirely around the town of Itaugua, a technique adapted by Paraguayan artisans into intricate circular patterns stitched by hand onto a wooden frame, a single large piece, sometimes taking weeks. In the town of Yataiti, artisans produce aupoi, a lightweight cotton cloth embroidered with fine parallel stitching, traditionally used for shirts, dresses, and church vestments. Both crafts are practiced overwhelmingly by women, passed down through families, and both face a shrinking base of young practitioners as cheaper, machine-made textiles undercut handwork that can take a month to finish. The chronology beneath all of this begins with semi-nomadic Chaco groups and settled Guaraní communities who occupied the region long before written history, followed by the Spanish arrival under Charles V's charter in the 1520s and Salazar's founding of Asunción in 1537. Without gold or silver, Paraguay remained a backwater of the Spanish Empire, its economy built around cattle, yerba mate, and the Jesuit mission network until the order's expulsion in 1767. Independence came in May 1811, followed by decades under the isolationist rule of José Gaspar Rodríguez de Francia, who governed from 1814 until his death in 1840 and sealed the country off from nearly all outside trade. Paraguay's most catastrophic chapter came next, the War of the Triple Alliance, fought from 1864 to 1870 against the combined forces of Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, is remembered as the deadliest conflict in Latin American history, with estimates suggesting a majority of the country's adult male population perished. The 20th century brought further conflict in the Chaco War against Bolivia, fought from 1932 to 1935, followed by decades of instability that culminated in General Alfredo Stroessner's coup on May 4, 1954. Stroessner ruled for nearly 35 years until his own ally, General Andrés Rodríguez, overthrew him in February 1989, ending the longest dictatorship in South American history. In the decades since, the country has stabilized politically while still confronting some of the most unequal land distribution in the hemisphere, alongside accelerating deforestation and an economy still heavily dependent on soy, cattle, and the electricity sold abroad from Itaipu. Morning breaks again over the Paraguay River, the way it has for nearly 500 years, and somewhere a gourd of tereré is already being passed hand to hand, wordlessly, between people who may not otherwise have spoken. Out in the Chaco, a jaguar that shouldn't exist according to the fossil record steps out from behind a thorn bush at dusk, unaware it was ever declared extinct. It is a country that generates enough electricity to light much of a neighboring nation, while some of its own citizens still carry water from a well. It speaks 2 official languages and, in practice, speaks a third one, made from blending them together without asking permission from either. It holds one of the only UNESCO sites in South America, built by an order that no longer exists in the country that expelled it, and it contains forests where some Ayoreo Totobiego Sode groups are believed to live in voluntary isolation, while indigenous organizations and rights groups campaign to protect their territory. Paraguay rarely makes headlines, rarely tops a travel list, rarely gets asked about at all, and it seems, in its own quiet way, to prefer it that way. If a place like this is worth a little more of your attention, it's worth hitting like and subscribing, because there are a lot more corners of the world just as overlooked as this one, still waiting to be looked at properly.